The message came at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening. I remember the exact time because I was stirring a pot of pasta, and I had just glanced at the clock on the microwave wondering if my husband Marcus would be home before it got cold. My phone buzzed on the counter. I assumed it was him. I reached over without looking, tapped the screen, and read it while steam curled up around my face. It was from my brother Daniel. "Kids are in a cab to your place. Be there in 20. Sorry." I stood there so long the pasta started sticking. I read it 3 more times, then I called him, straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I typed back, "Daniel, what is going on? Call me now." The 2 little check marks appeared, then they turned blue. He'd read it. He never responded. I stood in my kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand, and my heart doing something strange in my chest. Not quite panic yet, not quite anger. Something in between. Something that felt a lot like the moment before a car accident, when you can see it coming but your body hasn't caught up yet. 20 minutes later, a yellow cab pulled up in front of my house, and 2 kids got out. Zoe was 9, Caleb was 6. They were my niece and nephew. I hadn't seen them in 4 months. They were standing on my front step with one backpack between them, and Caleb was holding a stuffed rabbit that had lost one ear. Zoe looked at me with the expression of someone who has been told to be very brave and is working very hard at it. "Uncle Danny said you'd make dinner," Caleb said. I paid the cab driver. I brought them inside. I put more pasta in the pot, and somewhere on the other side of the city, my brother had turned off his phone and disappeared. Let me explain Daniel because none of this makes sense without understanding him first. He's 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one people trusted without question. He had this quality, I don't know what else to call it, of seeming completely solid, like there was a center of gravity around him. My parents used to say that Daniel would be fine no matter what happened, that he had his head on straight. Teachers said it, coaches said it, girlfriends said it, right up until they didn't. I always loved him, but I also always knew, in the way that younger siblings sometimes just know, that there was a version of Daniel the world saw and a version that existed underneath. He was charming when charming cost him nothing. He was generous when it made him look good. And when things got hard, when the center of gravity stopped holding, he had a habit of walking toward the nearest exit. I just never thought the exit would involve his children. He'd been married to Priya for 11 years. They had Zoe first, then Caleb. For a while things seemed fine. He had a decent job in commercial real estate. She worked part-time as a dental hygienist. They had a 3-bedroom house in a suburb 20 minutes from mine. I'd go over for Sunday dinners sometimes, watch the kids tear around the backyard, drink wine with Priya while Daniel talked too much about property values. But about 18 months before that cab pulled up, things started fraying. He and Priya had separated. He'd moved into a rental apartment. The divorce wasn't official, but it was obvious where things were headed. He didn't talk about it much. When I asked, he'd say things were complicated and change the subject. I tried a few times to really get into it with him, and each time he'd give me enough to feel like I knew what was happening without actually telling me anything that should have been my first clue. Marcus got home at 7:15 and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw Zoe and Caleb at our kitchen table. I gave him the look that meant I'll explain later, and he did what he always does, which is adjust quickly and go sit with the kids and ask Caleb about his rabbit. His name was apparently Roger, and Roger had lost the ear in a disagreement with a ceiling fan. Marcus nodded very seriously and said that ceiling fans were not to be trusted. After dinner, I got the kids settled in our guest room. Zoe asked me if her dad was coming to pick them up tonight. I told her I wasn't sure yet, but that everything was fine. She gave me a look that said she knew I was working very hard at being brave, same as her. When I came back downstairs, Marcus was at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. "He's not answering," I said. "I know." "His phone goes straight to voicemail." "I know." "Marcus, he sent his kids in a cab. A cab. They're 6 and 9 years old. They were in a taxi without an adult." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what the hell is happening." What I did that night was call Priya. She picked up on the second ring, which was the first thing that scared me, because the way she answered, That quick, expecting something, told me she already knew something was wrong. Rachel, she said. Not hello, just my name, like a statement. Priya, the kids are at my house. Daniel sent them in a cab. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough for me to feel something cold move through my stomach. Oh my God, she said. He actually did it! She came over that night. I remember Marcus offering her tea and her shaking her head, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands pressed flat against the surface like she needed to feel something solid. She told me that for the past 6 weeks Daniel had been threatening to leave. Not just leave the marriage, she said the marriage was already over. Leave the country. He'd been talking about Australia, about starting over, about how he was suffocating under the weight of the divorce proceedings, the custody arrangements, the financial obligations. He'd said more than once that he couldn't do it anymore. She'd thought it was just talk, dramatic, frustrated talk. The kind people say when they're overwhelmed and want someone to tell them it's going to be okay. She had not thought he would actually go. He has custody of the kids this week, she said. That's why. He has them. He had them. Oh God. I sat across from her and tried to understand what I was hearing. My brother, my responsible, steady, solid-seeming brother, had what? Booked a flight? Packed a bag? Sent his children to my house in a taxi and just gone? Has he called you? I asked. No, nothing since Sunday. What happened Sunday? She pressed her lips together. We had a meeting with the lawyers about the financial settlement. It was bad. The property, Rachel, the property situation is more complicated than I knew. I think he's in debt. Real debt. I don't know the full picture, but the lawyers were asking questions that scared me. I looked at Marcus. He looked at me. That's when I started to understand that the story I was living in was bigger than a thoughtless brother doing something reckless. Something else was happening here, something Daniel had been building quietly for a long time, right in front of us, while we all watched and didn't see it. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay there running backward through everything I knew about the last 18 months. There was the lunch about a year ago. Daniel had suggested we meet at a restaurant midway between our neighborhoods, nicer than we usually went to, and he'd been oddly warm. The kind of warm that makes you slightly suspicious after the fact. He'd asked a lot of questions about my finances. Not bluntly, in the way he did things, which was sideways, with plausible deniability. How's Marcus doing, still at the firm? Did we ever do anything with the house equity? We'd talked about that renovation. Do you guys have savings in one account or separate ones? At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, or maybe thinking about his own situation, trying to gauge where everyone else was. I didn't think about it again. Then there was the comment he made at my parents' anniversary dinner 4 months ago. My dad mentioned something about a will update, just casually, just your mother and I finally updated the paperwork kind of thing. Daniel had asked immediately whether the house was included. My dad seemed surprised by the directness of the question. Daniel laughed and said he was kidding. No one said anything else about it. And then there was the thing with the children's school. I'd found out from Priya's mother, not from Daniel, not from Priya at the time, that Daniel had pulled Zoe out of her after-school program without telling Priya. Said the cost was too much. Priya had been furious. But the thing I kept coming back to, lying in the dark, was this. Why would a man worried about cash flow be taking his kids to a restaurant and asking questions about other people's savings accounts? What was Daniel actually planning? The next morning I got the kids up, made them breakfast, and drove them to school. I used Priya's authorization. On the way, Zoe asked me again if her dad was coming home soon. I said I hoped so. Caleb asked if Roger could sit in the front seat on the way back. I said yes. When I got home, I did something I'd never done before. I called Daniel's landlord. I had the number because Marcus and I had helped Daniel move into his rental apartment a year ago, and I'd been the one to call about the elevator being out. I still had it saved. I called it and said I was checking in about my brother's unit, that I was concerned about him and couldn't reach him. The landlord paused. Then he told me that Daniel had given his notice 5 weeks ago, that he'd been out of the apartment for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My brother had been gone from his apartment for 3 weeks, and none of us had known. I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time after that call. He hadn't just left. He'd been planning this. This was not a man who snapped and made a rash decision. This was a man who had quietly, methodically been preparing to disappear, and had arranged things so that the last loose ends, his children, would land on the person he trusted most to deal with them. Me. Priya and I started talking every day after that. At first it was just coordination. The kids, the school, the logistics, then it became something else. We started putting things together. The financial picture was worse than Priya had realized during the marriage. The property she and Daniel had bought together was mortgaged beyond its value. He'd taken out a second mortgage 18 months ago, right around the time they separated, and used the money for something she'd never been able to identify. The divorce lawyers were trying to untangle it. There were credit card debts in amounts that made my stomach hurt. There were what appeared to be personal loans from private lenders. And there was, I found out through a friend of Priya's who worked in accounting, a business venture, a small real estate investment company Daniel had been running quietly for 2 years, that appeared to have lost a very significant amount of money in a deal that went badly about 7 months ago. He had been drowning. And instead of telling anyone, instead of asking for help working something out, dealing with it, he had chosen this, the disappearance, the clean break, the children left on someone else's doorstep. The thing that kept hitting me was this: he had loved his kids. I believed that. I think he still did. In whatever complicated, self-justifying way he'd rearranged everything in his mind to make this okay. But love, I was realizing, is not the same as choosing someone. And Daniel had spent years making choices, quiet and systematic choices, that always ended with choosing himself. It was Marcus who found it. He'd been quietly doing some digging of his own. He works in finance and knows how to look at documents in ways I don't. One evening, about 3 weeks after the kids arrived, he came and sat across from me at the kitchen table with his laptop, and that particular expression he gets when he's figured something out he wishes he hadn't. "I need to show you something," he said. He turned the screen toward me. It was a property listing, a small commercial property in Queensland, Australia. The listed owner was a company name I didn't recognize, but Marcus had traced it. I won't explain the whole of how, because it involved several steps I still don't entirely understand. Back through 2 shell registrations to a numbered company in New Zealand. And the director of that numbered company, per public registry, was a person whose name I did recognize. It wasn't Daniel, it was my father. I made Marcus show me again, twice. I sat with it for a long time. My father, who had updated his will 4 months ago. Whose house Daniel had immediately asked about at dinner. Who had, I now remembered, traveled to New Zealand for a fishing trip about 14 months back, which I had thought nothing of because my dad liked fishing and it seemed perfectly reasonable my father had known. Not everything, maybe, but something. He had been part of something with Daniel, and whatever it was, it had been set up long enough ago that either my father was helping Daniel hide assets, or, and this was the thought I sat with longest, my father had been used by Daniel the same way I had, just earlier, just differently, in a way he might not even fully understand yet. I needed to talk to my parents, but I needed to be careful about how I did it. I'm not a person who moves quickly when I'm angry. I've learned over the years that anger is loudest right when it's least useful. What I've learned to do instead is get quiet, get organized, figure out exactly what I know, what I don't know, and what I need. So that's what I did. The first thing I did was consult a lawyer, not a family lawyer, a civil litigation attorney who specialized in fraud and asset concealment. I told her everything. She told me several things in return, the most important of which was this: if Daniel had transferred assets to that company knowing he had pending divorce proceedings and financial obligations, that was potentially fraudulent conveyance. Which meant those assets could, under the right circumstances, be reclaimed. Which meant Priya's position in the divorce proceedings was stronger than anyone had realized. The second thing I did was very carefully, very gently, sit down with my father. I didn't go in swinging, I went in with questions. I told him I'd been going through some things related to Daniel's situation and I'd come across a company name I didn't understand. I asked him if he knew anything about a business called, and I said the name. My father's face did something I'd never seen it do before. He went very still. And then he said quietly, "Where did you find that?" He had not helped Daniel hide money. That much became clear in the conversation that followed. But he had, 14 months ago, been asked by Daniel to put his name on a company registration as a favor, as a formality, as something that wouldn't mean anything. Daniel had told him it was a tax structure thing. My father, who was not a financial person and trusted his son completely, had signed where he was told to sign. He had not known what he was signing. He had not known about the Australian property. He had not known any of it. By the end of that conversation, my father was the color of old chalk, and he was asking me what we should do. And I told him, carefully, step by step. What followed was not dramatic. That's the thing no one tells you about real justice. It's slow and administrative, and it mostly happens in offices. Priya's divorce lawyers, now armed with the company information, filed for full financial disclosure. They engaged a forensic accountant. The Australian property came to light in an official capacity. Because Daniel had concealed it during divorce proceedings, it constituted fraud on the court. His position became legally much more precarious. My father, with his own lawyer present, made a full statement about his role and his ignorance. Because he'd acted in good faith and cooperated immediately, his exposure was limited. He was embarrassed and shaken, and in the months that followed, he and I had several long conversations that changed something between us, open to honesty we hadn't had before. We also found Daniel. It wasn't hard, actually. He'd been sloppy in certain ways. Men who run from things often are because they're optimists underneath. They believe the chaos will swallow the evidence. He'd kept his Australian phone number linked to an old email address. A friend of Priya's who worked in immigration cross-referenced some publicly available travel records. He was in Brisbane. He'd rented an apartment. He'd apparently gotten a job working for a property developer, using skills he had, even if he'd left his ethics behind. The formal process was slow, but it moved. Australian authorities, when presented with the relevant documentation about the outstanding divorce judgment and the asset concealment, were cooperative. The commercial property was identified and entered into the divorce settlement. It wasn't everything Priya was owed, but it was substantial. Enough to make a real difference for her and the kids. Daniel was required to participate in the divorce proceedings remotely. He'd hired an Australian lawyer. There were video calls. I wasn't present for any of them, but Priya told me about his face on the screen, how he looked smaller than she'd ever seen him, and how he'd said almost nothing except what his lawyer told him to say. He did not ask about the children during those calls. That detail stayed with me longer than any of the rest of it. There was one more thing, and this is the part I'm not entirely sure I'm proud of. But I'm not entirely sure I'm not proud of either. Daniel had apparently not told his new employer the full picture. He'd used a curated version of his resume, leaned on his real expertise in real estate, and started building a new professional life in Brisbane, without the shadow of his UK record following him. I found out the name of the development company he worked for. It wasn't hard. He'd been tagged in a professional LinkedIn post someone had made. And I sat for 2 weeks deciding what to do with it. I didn't contact them anonymously. I didn't send them a scorched earth email. What I did was write a very careful, factual letter, reviewed by my lawyer, informing them that there was ongoing legal action in the UK relating to a former employee's financial conduct, and that if they were conducting due diligence on the matter, there were public court records they might wish to review. I gave them the case numbers. I signed my full name. I don't know exactly what happened after that. I heard through a third channel, about 2 months later, that Daniel had left that job. Whether he was let go or left on his own terms, I never found out. I told myself it didn't matter. I mostly believe that. What I do know is this: it became harder. For him. Which is all I wanted. Not destroyed. Not annihilated. Not living in misery forever. Just harder. Just. You don't get to walk away and land softly while everyone you left behind deals with the damage. The kids lived with us for 11 weeks. I want to say that carefully, because it's the part of this whole thing I think about most. 11 weeks is a long time when you're 6 and 9, long enough for a new normal to start forming, Long enough for Caleb to start leaving Roger the rabbit on the couch instead of carrying him everywhere. Long enough for Zoe to start doing her homework at our kitchen table without being asked. Marcus was extraordinary during those weeks. He was patient in a way that cost him. I knew it cost him because we'd talked, before any of this, about the fact that we didn't know yet whether we wanted children of our own, and having 2 children suddenly in the house answered several questions we hadn't been ready to answer. He coached Caleb through a school project on volcanoes. He braided Zoe's hair twice, badly but with such seriousness that she said it was fine. Priya got a larger apartment and the kids went back to her in week 12. The transition was easier than I expected because Priya had become, through all of this, someone I trusted and liked in a way I'd never had the chance to before. We'd been friendly as sisters-in-law. Now we were something closer to actual friends. We'd been in the trenches together. That changes people. The kids still come over on some Saturdays. Caleb has started calling our dog by a name that the dog doesn't respond to, but accepts. Zoe asked me once carefully whether I was angry at her dad. I told her something that was true, that I was sad, more than angry, and that the things her dad did were grown-up mistakes that had nothing to do with her. She nodded like she was filing that away. She's a serious kid, she's going to be formidable when she grows up. He called me, eventually. 5 months after the taxi, it was a Sunday morning. I was in the garden. I saw his name on my phone and I stood there looking at it through 4 full rings before I answered. "Rachel," he said. I didn't say anything. "I know you're angry," he said. "I'm not angry, Daniel. You wrote to my employer." I sent a factual letter with public court records. Yes. Silence on the line. I could hear something in the background. Traffic, maybe, or wind. "I want to explain." "You don't need to explain," I said. "I understand. You were in a hole you didn't know how to get out of, and you chose the option that let you leave. I understand it. That doesn't mean I think it was okay." "The kids are fine. They're with their mother. They ask about you sometimes." I paused. "Caleb still carries the rabbit." Another silence, longer. "I didn't think," he started. "No," I said, "that's exactly it. You didn't think. Or you thought and you decided that what you needed was more important than what they needed. Those are the only 2 options, Daniel, and I'm not sure which one is worse." I heard something happen in his voice that I couldn't quite name. Not crying. Something drier than that. "I was going under," he said. "I know, you could have told us." I couldn't. "I know you believe that," I said. "I think that's the saddest part." We didn't talk for much longer after that. He said he was trying to stabilize things, that he was working, that he wanted to figure out a way to be present for Zoe and Caleb even from a distance. I told him that Priya was open to that conversation if he was willing to approach it through the proper legal channels. He said he would. I don't know if he will. I'd like to think that he'll find his way to it eventually, to some version of being their father, even an imperfect remote one. But I've stopped building plans around what Daniel will or won't do. That's work I had to put down. Here is what a yellow cab and 2 kids with 1 backpack taught me. People can love you and still use you. These things aren't mutually exclusive. Daniel loved me, I think, in the way he was capable of loving anyone who wasn't himself. That love was real, and it was also at the same time a calculation. I was reliable. I was close enough. I would not let his children starve on the doorstep. He was right about all of that. And in making use of all of that, he did something that changed the shape of what we were to each other, maybe permanently. I've thought a lot about the moment the text came in, the way I was stirring pasta, the way the steam rose up, how ordinary everything was, right up until it wasn't. That's how most things actually happen, not with warning signals and alarm bells, but with ordinary moments that suddenly become the before and the after. My father is doing okay. He and my mother came for dinner last month. He is still not entirely over the embarrassment of having been used by his own son, and I think he won't be for a long time. But he is trying to be present for Priya and the grandchildren in ways he wasn't before. Sometimes it takes something terrible to shake loose the effort that should have been there all along. Marcus and I talked, after all of it settled, about what we actually wanted. The 11 weeks had clarified things that had been blurry. We've started that conversation, the real one, the one about what comes next for us. I don't know where it lands yet, but the first know that whatever we build, we're building it on something honest. Priya is doing better than she was. Not great. Some days are hard, and single parenting is genuinely brutal, and the financial settlement, while better than expected, is not what it would have been if Daniel had behaved decently. But she is steadier than I've ever seen her. She said something to me a few weeks ago that's been sitting with me since. I spent years managing his anxiety so he wouldn't have to feel it, she said, and the whole time I thought that was love. I think actually it was just keeping the house of cards standing. I didn't say anything because she was right, and sometimes right things don't need a response. There's one last thing I want to tell you, the single backpack that the kids arrived with. I found out later that Daniel had packed it. He had carefully, deliberately chosen what went in it. A change of clothes for each of them, their school IDs, Zoe's medication for her mild asthma, Caleb's rabbit. He knew exactly which medications and which comfort objects mattered. He packed those things because he is still their father, even now, even from a distance, even in the worst version of himself. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not sure I have to do anything with it. Some things you just carry. The backpack is in my guest room closet. I haven't thrown it out. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because it's the truest thing in this whole story. The proof that even people capable of real cruelty can also, in the same moment, be paying attention. The two facts don't cancel each other out. They just sit there, side by side, in a bag with one broken zipper pull. That's not a comfortable place to end up. But it's an honest one.